to see me during this week, but I decided to make videos on the last few things that I want to discuss before the school year was over. As you guys know, I'm probably either in the hospital or back home with my wife and my new baby, and I just wanted to just make a couple videos about the last few chapters because I couldn't really find any good ones online. So I just took it upon myself to make you guys some videos. Now, make sure you're paying attention, following along, taking good notes. Some of these, you can expect some questions about this material on your final exam. So this is not just like a filler or just a waste of time. So make sure you're paying attention, taking those good notes. The questions that you'll see will be relatively simple, nothing super complex or no essay question or anything like that. But make sure you're still paying attention so you're able to answer those questions, kind of understand it. Now, in this chapter, chapter 17, we're going to be talking about arthropods. Arthropods are one of my favorite things to talk about because a lot of times we don't consider arthropods as animals, but they most definitely are. Now, in this chapter, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what makes an arthropod and the different groups of arthropods. Make sure you're kind of writing quickly or just highlighting in your book like I told you for last week, right? I'm going to be going through these stuff rather quickly, just giving you kind of the basis knowledge about it so we could have talked about it before the school year was over. Be skipping slides here and there, so if you see me just quickly skip through it, don't worry, it's not the end of the world, you'll be fine. So let's go ahead and get started. So phylum Arthropoda, this is the largest phylum in kingdom Animalia, right? If I go to the next slide here, you can see what it means by the fact that it's the largest group. All right, so if you see this section right here, that section is everything else. The reddish, orangish rest of the diagram, those are arthropods, right? So arthropods make a huge percentage of all the animals here on Earth. And you can see right here, this green section, those are chordates. And that's everything that you know to be an animal, like a bird, a dog, a cat. All of those things are chordates, and they make one of the smallest groups of animals out there. So it's very interesting that the thing that we associate with animals is actually not one of the largest groups of those animals. So arthropods make a big percentage of all the animals here. Then all arthropods are invertebrates. That means that they do not have a backbone or a spinal column. They have what we call an exoskeleton. And within these arthropods are three major categories. You have chelicerates, crustaceans, and insects. We'll talk about those three different categories individually. All right, so then what makes an arthropod or arthropod? So these are a couple attributes. The first of which is they have an open circulatory system. This is very interesting because they're really different from that of what we see in other animals and what we're most common with, like within humans. So if you look at your wrist, you can see that you have those arteries and veins that run through you. You can even see to the left of our room, I believe there's a little diagram there of the human body. So what's the difference between an open circulatory system and our circulatory system, which is called a closed circulatory system? It's easier if I tell you what a closed circulatory system is first, then I tell you what that one is. So a closed circulatory system is what we see in our bodies. We have arteries and veins that run the entire length of our body and take blood individually to each organ. So that's why we have, arteries and veins that go into our limbs, arteries and veins that go into our, rest of our internal organs, right? That's what it means to be a closed circulatory system. An open circulatory system is not that way. So instead of having arteries and veins that run to each individual organ, they have a couple major arteries that reach the majority of the body, and then that blood spurts out of the body and over the organs, and then it just kind of floods those organs with oxygen and blood and nutrients, and then it's recollected, sent back, and then the process continues. That's pretty interesting. Now, like I said, they have an exoskeleton, unlike us. So if you look to the back right of our room, okay, there's an image of our skeleton. Now, their skeleton is a little different. Instead of being on the inside of their bodies, it's on the outside. And it's like a protective coating of armor, and that's going to be the main purpose of this, right? It's support and then protection. Now, support is the very same support as our bones, right? Our bones let us have our shape, stand up, and all that stuff. And then our muscles attached to those bones that allow them to move. It's the same thing for exoskeleton. It gives it support, and then the muscles attached to it. Now, the interesting thing about exoskeleton is that it doesn't grow along with the animal. Unlike our bodies, our skeletal system, as we get bigger, it gets bigger. Their skeletal system does not. So they have to molt. And molting is a really interesting process in arthropods because that's when the animal is at its weakest because it doesn't have its protective coating. So what it'll do, molt its exoskeleton or like drop it off, like take it off, and then it'll swell up with water. As it swells up with water, it expands and goes big like a water balloon. And it'll then, in that expanded state, it'll fill up, it'll produce the exoskeleton again, release the water, and as it releases, it leaves a little bit of space in between the exoskeleton and the rest of the body, which allows for the animal to grow into the empty space, and then the process continues. So that's really interesting. Then you have jointed appendages. Now this is really important, okay? This is the main distinguishing factor between arthropods and every other animal that comes before this, right? So all the other animals that come before this don't have appendages. And this is the first time we see a joint, okay? Like what we see in our bodies, this is the first time we see it. So that's why arthropods are called arthropods. Actually, the word arthropod stands for jointed appendage. All right, and like it says there, they also have eyes. And this is one of the first times we see full functioning eyes as well. They have a segmented body, and we know about segmented bodies because an ant is a great example. It has a head, thorax, and abdomen. We as humans also have a segmented body, but our thorax and abdomen are kind of connected. It's kind of hard to tell them apart. So we have our head, and we have our thorax, that is the basically from the shoulders to like right about the end of the rib cage, and then after that is your abdomen. And they have a very similar thing too. So what are the difference of these three body parts? So the head is where cephalization occurs. You guys should know what cephalization is. What is it? Okay, good. Hopefully you thought about the answer within a few seconds before I tell you. All right. Cephalization is a grouping of organs in the head. So this is what we see here in arthropods. They have eyes, they have antenna, and all these things that group in the head area. So head, brain, eyes, sensory organs, all grouped there. Thorax is where we see a big majority of the vital organs, things like hearts, lungs, and other things like that. Now, not all insects have hearts, not all insects have lungs and hearts and stuff like that, so it's a little bit there, but that's where we see a collection of the vital organs, and it's typically the middle of the body, and then the abdomen is where the intestines are. Right? Then they also have a nervous system. All right, so chelicerates. Now, what makes a chelicerate different from the other ones? So, like it says there, these are arthropods that have one or two body sections. So, a huge way to tell organisms apart in the kingdom arthropod is how many body segments they have. So, chelicerates only have one or two, and examples of chelicerates are things like spiders, ticks, scorpions, right? All of these are going to be chelicerates. So, for example, a spider that you would have in your house would not be an insect. It would be this thing right here. They also have claw-like appendages, right? Those claw-like appendages allow them to grab things, right? A lot of arachnids fall under this group. So some chelicerate structure. Like it says there, most have 4 pairs of walking legs, like an arachnid has 8 legs. They have 1 or 2 body sections. Okay, so they typically have either a head and a thorax abdomen that is attached, or they'll have a head, thorax, abdomen attached all into one body segment. If you turn in your book to page number 335, you can see an image of all of that stuff, or all the different types of chelicerates there. All right, so if you turn your book to page 335, right there you can see it. They have what we call pedipalps. These are sensory organs that are found near the front of the organism, right? And they're used to be able to sense things for the animal as they walk around and eat. Since they don't have an antenna, they don't really have those sensory organs like other insects do, right? And they have simple eyes. So instead of having compound eyes, they have just a singular eye. All right, next, unique features about them. They have book lungs or book gills. This is different, especially from other insects, right? Insects do not have lungs. They have a very simple form of lungs. And we're going to go from there. Mafillian tubule, also used in breathing, waste, and stuff like that. Spinneret, in spiders, they produce the spider web. So let's keep going. Chelicerate reproduction. Most aquatic chelicerates reproduce sexually through external fertilization, terrestrial sexually through internal fertilization. Let's keep going. All right, so what's the goal or what's the purpose of chelicerates, like spiders and all these things? For the most part, their purpose is to be predators. They're going to eat other arthropods. Most specifically, their role is going to be to keep the insect population down. All right, now crustaceans. Crustaceans are the second largest group of arthropods. The first is going to be insects. And most crustaceans are going to be aquatic or marine animals. So these are going to live inside of the water. Most spend a majority of the time in water. They have 2 or 3 body sections, and a lot of them are going to have what we call a carapace. And this is what's found on page number, let me find it for you. Okay, page number 339. I'm going to put a picture, I'm going to put my book up to the camera so you can see it. All right, so if you look at this picture of a lobster right here, or crayfish, whatever this is a crayfish, very similar to the lobster. Right, this part right here, from the bottom of this line to the head, as you can see, there's no division, but there's kind of this line right here. This line shows that the head and the thorax are fused. So fusing of the head of the thorax is called the carapace, and that's what we see in the aquatic organism or crustaceans. And it just fuses those two together. And that's why a lot of them only have 2 or 3 body sections. Some of them will have 1, right? But for the most part, they're going to have 2 or 3. Then they have swimmerets. If you're on page 339, you can see the picture of that shrimp. And it's on the bottom right there. Underneath the shrimp, you have these tiny legs here. Those tiny legs are what we call swimmerets. Now, the name is a little misleading. They think they're meant for swimming, which they do help with swimming, like it says. But they're not. That's not just their only importance. So swimmerets help with swimming, but their major importance is reproduction. And a lot of those swimmerets are where the animals is going to be able to store eggs for fertilization, and also a lot of the reproductive organs are going to be found right there with the swimmerets as well. All right. So what are some structures? Like it says there, 5 pair of walking legs. So they tend to have 10 legs. Chelicpeds, claws, right? And here is where we first see antenna in arthropods, but they actually have 2 sets of antennae. So they can have up to 4 antennae. Sometimes they may have a little bit more, but they have 4 antennae. And that's what they use to sense. So that's kind of how they smell chemicals that are in the water with those antennae. They have mandibles. These are little tiny mouth parts. You can't really see a picture of that. You can kind of see them a little bit on that page on 339. But the interesting thing about mandibles, instead of going up and down this way, they'll actually have a portion that goes up and down, but they'll have a portion that also goes side to side. They do have a digestive system, open circulatory system, and they have gills since they're found in the water. And like it says there, crustacean reproduction is usually external fertilization. And the reason for that is because we've talked about this. If an animal lives in water, a big majority of fertilization is going to happen externally. So the eggs are going to be either released out in in a huge spawning moment where they release a bunch of eggs and sperm into the water and they fertilize that way. Or they can have localized external fertilization where the female will release the eggs and then the male comes in and fertilizes them. Like it says there, some of them are capable of regenerating body parts. Now, crustaceans are super important, right? All arthropods are very important because of where they're found in the food system. But I'm going to focus on this right here where it talks about krill as a keystone species. A lot of crustaceans are key to the environment. One, they're going to be really important at removing detritus. This is waste products from other animals, other things that people don't want to eat. But secondly, they are a huge aspect of food. So that's what it means here by a keystone species. That if you were to if you look at the food chain, right, you have, like, let's say the humans, but all the way through, if you look at an aquatic system, so you have a killer whale on top, and then as you go through the food chain, at the bottom you have krill. And the krill are so important because the krill are a big connection between aquatic photosynthetic life, like phytoplankton, and other life in the ocean that cannot do photosynthesis, so they have to eat. So they're carnivores. They have to eat something else. So all of the energy transfer from algae to the rest of the animals in the aquatic system are going to come from krill. So they're really, really important. If you were to remove krill, you would basically kill the entire ecosystem because the way that energy is passed on is that there'll be krill, something a little bigger, maybe a smaller fish will eat a krill, and something will eat that smaller fish, and that process continues all the way up the food chain. So krill are really, really important in the ecosystem. All right, and there's the crustaceans. We're moving quickly. Now, insects. Insects are really, really cool. A lot of times we just don't really like them because they're kind of annoying. They can be avenues for disease and stuff like that. So a lot of times we think they're a little annoying. So you can also see a picture of the structure of a crustacean on page 340. You can see this picture right here, and that breaks down the structure. So you go ahead and look at that picture. You can see the parts that talks about carapace and all that stuff. But let's get back onto insects. So insects are really cool. They're super, super important. Again, they're a big part of the food chain and all that stuff. So we'll talk about that here. So like it says, they're the largest class within phylum Arthropoda. So out of all of the animals, right? So if I go back up here to when we talked about that circle, okay? This is just all animals. This section right here are all other arthropods, so chelicerates and crustaceans. That's this portion right here. Everything else, this big portion here, that's insects. So a huge part of our animals, those are all going to be insects. And there's a huge variety of them. Just within this picture, you see so many different types of insects. They're super fun, super interesting to talk about. So they have 3 body parts. This is going to be the major thing that tells them apart. So if you look at something and you don't know if it's an insect or not, see, does it have a distinct head, thorax, and abdomen? If it does, it's most likely an arthropod. Now, if you see 3 distinct parts and it's in the water, it may be a crustacean. But in general, right, if it's on land and it has 3 distinct body parts, it's most likely an insect. Then after that, you say, well, it has 3 body parts, but how else do I tell? You look at and you count the legs. If it has 2 sets of 3 legs, or 3 and 3 on either side, 6 legs, it's also an insect. They also have only 1 pair of antennae, so this is another difference between them. Instead of having 4, they'll only have 2. Think of an ant. And they'll have compound eyes. Like it says there, almost all insects have wings. That's another really usual detail about insects, is that they will have wings. And those wings are so many varieties of wings. If you look on page 342, 343, right there, you can see all of the variety between the wings that we see on insects. Now, you may be thinking, Mr. Rodriguez, well, I know that an ant is an insect. So is an ant just an insect that doesn't have wings? Actually, ants do have wings. So when we talk about there that almost all insects have wings, is that at some point in their lifespan, they'll develop wings. Either in their larval stage, they'll have wings, or in their adult stage, they'll have wings. So for example, think of a butterfly. When a butterfly is a caterpillar, it's still an insect, but it doesn't have wings. But as it goes through metamorphosis, it'll develop wings. So at some point, either in their adult stage or at some point in their lifespan, they will have some form of wings. Ants will have wings, and they'll have wings during their nuptial flights. It's during reproduction. So they'll produce male and female ants. They'll fly out from the ant colony and then start new ones. So that's what called nuptial flights. Really interesting stuff. Okay, a few insects have no wings. Some have 1 pair of wings. Some have 2 pair of wings. If you want to really look at all the different types of wings, those are in those 2 pages there in your textbook. All right, how do they get their nutrition? So there are a few different ways that they can get their nutrition. So I'm just going to go ahead and slide this over so you can see it. If you look over here, those are the few different body types. They have a piercing mouth, a sponge mouth, siphoning mouth, and chewing mouth. So those are the differences there. If you look at it, they all get nutrition in different ways. A piercing mouth is going to be found typically in a mosquito, and they'll pierce the skin of something, typically of an organism, and they'll extract nutrients in the form of blood, and that's what they eat. Sponging mouth is found in housefly, where they have a little mouth that just kind of suctions up and gets nutrients that way. They have a siphoning mouth that's typically found in insects that are going to eat from flowers, like butterflies. They'll have a long proboscis or a long, curled up mouth that can unravel and extend into that long, thin tube of the flower and get nectar that way. And you have a chewing mouth, and these are the most typical form of eating an insect, where they have an actual mouth. And they have mandibles as well that chew sideways and up and down. Right? An interesting thing that I want to talk about is this point right here, spiracles. These are tiny openings that are found on the outside of the insects. They have a little or outside of their exoskeleton. These tiny openings are there. Those tiny openings allow for gas exchange. So gas comes in, and that's how they get their oxygen. So they don't really have a full functioning kind of lung, right? Gas exchange just happens passively through their skin, right? Um, this is the structure of a insect. We're not going to go into huge detail about it, but there you can see a bunch of different types of organs. This is what I was referring to earlier. These are all the vital organs found inside of an insect, and this is the blood vessel that has it. As you can see, there are no arteries and veins that run to each one of these organs. So what will happen is that the blood will basically seep out of this blood vessel and coat the organs in blood, and that's how they get the food and nutrients that they need. Okay. Now, the reason why this is kind of interesting is because if you, let's say you took an insect and flipped it upside down, this organ, this type of circulatory system relies on gravity. Gravity pushes the blood down, it refills back up, and is allowed to be basically pushed back through. Since they rely on gravity, if you put an insect upside down, the blood will pull along the back, and it could actually harm the insect and not get the blood it needs to the rest of the body. So that's kind of interesting. They do produce pheromones. This is kind of a way that they can communicate from one to the other. Insect called, the ant is going to be the one that's going to really rely on pheromones. They also use pheromones for attracting a mate as well. Since a lot of insects are found on land, they're going to have to reproduce through internal fertilization. This is what I want to talk about. A lot of insects will go through few different life cycles. You have metamorphosis, and you also have incomplete metamorphosis. So go ahead and turn your book to page number 346, and there you can see both types of metamorphosis, incomplete and complete. So incomplete metamorphosis, you can see the image there on page 346. I'll go ahead and slide this over a little bit so you can see it. Okay, they'll start an egg and it'll hatch. And the interesting thing about incomplete metamorphosis is that when the insect hatches out of the egg, it's basically going to just be a miniature version of the adult. And what it's going to be is going to, like it says there, it's going to be a nymph. It's basically an infant or a child and a preteen. It's very similar to the way that a human goes from baby to an adult, right? It's the same thing with no change in the insect. Okay. What makes the difference between them is that they're basically going to develop their adult structures. So they're going to develop their reproductive structures, they're going to develop wings and those things. And after it's a mature adult, that'll have all of the things that it would normally have. Then in complete metamorphosis, which is this right here, this is where we see something completely different. Okay, there's an egg. The insect hatches from the egg, and it's in larval stage. And a lot of insects are going to reproduce in this manner, where they'll hatch into this larval stage, which is like a worm-like structure. You can think of a caterpillar. If you've ever seen like a grub from a housefly or a grub of a beetle, any of those things, those are all larval stages. And the main purpose of that larval stage is to eat. They're going to eat a lot in preparation for the metamorphosis. So once they've eaten enough, they create a pupa, a cocoon, so forth. This is a part where the animal is typically immovable, so it attaches itself to something, and that's when it changes. And metamorphosis means it's changing completely. So it goes from being a larva, and they develop into something completely different, like a monarch butterfly. Okay, so those are some things that we're pretty familiar with. All right. Insects in the environment. Now, the thing about insects in an environment is that it can be a social farm in regards to, most specifically, disease. A huge way that disease is passed on is by insects, since they live in our trash and other stuff like that. They can be a really big access to disease. They can carry disease in themselves. For example, the mosquito carries blood, and one of the most harmful diseases in the in the world is going to be malaria, and that is transmitted by the mosquito, by the blood that it's carrying inside of it. So when it pierces somebody, it leaves some blood behind, and if it has malaria in it, it's going to pass it on. Then they can also have the disease on their actual body, on their exoskeleton, so they can walk over something and walk over your food, which could cause infection and stuff like that. They can also be a big harm in agriculture. Huge crops can be destroyed by insects as they come through in swarms, and they just can eat everything, which obviously would not be a good thing. But they do do a lot more good than they do harm, right? They're a vital part of the food web, right? They're in the bottom. A lot of birds, small reptiles, and even mammals are going to be eating insects as their primary source of food, because insects eat plants, and then there's a lot of animals out there that will eat insects. So they're really, really important. They don't get the term keystone species because if you removed insects, it'd be a huge hit to the food system. But on land, a lot of animals will still be able to consume plants, and then other animals would be able to consume those animals. So it's not as big of a hit, but it'd still be a big deal. So that's why they don't get the modicum keystone species. Another reason why they're so important is because they're pollinators. Every flower, every fruit is going to be mainly pollinated by some form of insect, mainly the common bee, right? The bee is going to be a huge aspect of pollination. They do a huge percentage of it. But other insects do it too, because a lot of insects like that nice sugary nectar. So they'll go to or fly to these leaves, to these flowers, and carry the pollen to other flowers. So they're a huge proponent of pollination, which is how a lot of us get the food, or a big percentage of our food comes from that process of pollination. Okay? And that's it. That's the end of chapter 17. I hope you guys enjoyed this quick video on arthropods, and I'll see you guys tomorrow in another video. See ya.